Saw Gerrera, he ranks among the most painful deaths in Star Wars. Killed on Jedha when the Death Star destroyed the Holy City. A battered veteran of the Clone Wars, Gerrera continued leading insurgents against the Empire from an ancient bunker on Jedha with ailing health. He had rescued a child named Jyn Erso from Lahamu and raised her as his own, then abandoned her years later when her real identity became too dangerous to shelter. He allowed Anto Kreegyr and his soldiers to walk into an Imperial ambush to protect the identity of Luthen Rael's ISB spy, and the loss of his sister Steela during the Onderon Rebellion had left him a shell of his former self. Forrest Whitaker portrays him in Rogue One, a Star Wars story. But the canon sources do not describe his death scene at all. The researchers building this list found that detail hardest to reconcile with his placement here. The list asked for the most painful deaths, and Gerrera earned his slot through the weight of everything he lost. Sister, daughter, cause, decades of war grinding him down to nothing. But the moment you try to describe the death itself, the sources go quiet. There is no final scene, no farewell, no on-screen passing to weigh against the others. The design reason for his inclusion becomes clear when you look at how the list was constructed. It was built for viewers who respond to accumulated loss, who feel the weight of a character's whole story when that story ends. Gerrera's ending was deliberately left off-screen, which means the video can only honor him by reconstructing what he carried, not by showing what finally broke him. That is who this slot was built for, the fighter whose entire arc is loss, whose final chapter was never filmed, and whose pain lives entirely in the viewer's memory of everything he survived. Subscribe and tell us in the comments which character death you think was the most gut-wrenching. Let's get back into it. Jedi younglings, Padawan learners at the Jedi Temple on Coruscant. They die during Order 66 in Revenge of the Sith. A Looper ranking places the younglings as the second most tragic Jedi death in canon, sitting higher than named Jedi with distinct personalities and screen time. The article's author, however, found them unmemorable and emotionally unaffecting, stating plainly that they did not know who the characters were and moved on quickly. That contradiction is where the strangeness lives. A ranking system designed to measure sadness assigns these younglings a high position, and then the person applying that system admits to feeling nothing for them. They appear in the temple as Anakin marches through in a single sequence, a group of children in brown robes caught in the middle of a massacre. They do not speak, they do not get individual moments, they are a collective casualty, killed mid-action, and the author processed them as exactly that. A nameless cluster of bodies that registered as sad in the abstract, and then immediately left the mine. What proves about the category as a whole is that Star Wars death rankings run on a structural contradiction. The ranking treats the younglings as a unit with measurable emotional weight, but the author's actual experience, no names, no faces, no lingering grief, reveals that you cannot truly mourn a group you never knew as individuals. Their placement at number 9 says the system wants to honor them, but their facelessness in the film makes that honor hollow. They are the proof that anonymous suffering gets filed as a statistic, even by a ranking built to feel the opposite. Padmé Amidala, Senator of Naboo, former queen, wife of Anakin Skywalker, she dies at the end of Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. A 27-year-old human female from modest origins who rose to queen and then to the Senate, she is force-choked by Anakin on Mustafar until she passes out after revealing that Obi-Wan is with her. On Mustafar, Anakin accuses her of betrayal and reaches for her throat. She fights to speak, tells him Obi-Wan has already arrived, and he tightens his grip until she goes limp. Obi-Wan carries her unconscious body away from the lava shore, loads her onto a ship, and the film cuts forward. She wakes on Police Massa long enough to give birth to Luke and Leia, delivered by medical droids while Bail Organa and Obi-Wan watch. She dies moments after the children are born, and the medical droid tells Obi-Wan she has lost the will to live. What it is, stripped of any filmmaking distance, is a deliberate ambiguity. Not a lightsaber wound, not a fall, not injuries from the lava fields, no cause of death is given in the canon sources. Obi-Wan and Yoda sense her passing in the Force. Bail Organa is present. The medical droids report a complete loss of life and nothing more. The canon has consistently presented her death as the result of a broken heart. The question the evidence leaves open is why the canon has never resolved it. If Padme died from Anakin's violence, directly from the Force choke, or indirectly from its consequences, it would harden his turn into unambiguous monstrosity rather than the tragic fall the saga wants it to be. If she died of something else entirely, the film never bothered to say so. The silence has lasted across every canon release since 2014, and nobody in the Lucasfilm era has closed it. Han Solo. The next death involves a character who never had any political ambitions at all, a smuggler who spent 3 decades running from responsibility, and a death so brutal and so abruptly finalized that it redefined what a franchise would let happen to its most beloved character. Han Solo appears in The Force Awakens as a figure who had been in Star Wars fans' lives for decades, a smuggler whose irreverence and survival instinct had defined the original trilogy's emotional core. His death in The Force Awakens ranks among the more tragic deaths in the entire canon, and the script had been building toward it for 40 years. Harrison Ford had wanted Solo to die in Return of the Jedi, and Ford was not signed on for the subsequent episodes, meaning the character's arc had no forward trajectory beyond that film. The execution was specific and devastating. Solo dies on a walkway with no railing, stabbed by his own son, falling into the reactor shaft beneath the walkway. The staging was deliberate. No last-minute rescue, no ambiguous cut to black, just a body tumbling away from the only people who'd ever loved him. One viewer went numb watching it happen, then cried in the theater, then cried again in the car, the remainder of the film unfolding for them in slow motion. Every subsequent scene filtered through the knowledge that Han Solo was gone. In theater lobbies across the country, other viewers erupted in celebration, jubilation at the death of a character they'd grown up with, creating a dissonance so sharp it felt like 2 different movies were playing at once. The contrast between collective grief and collective celebration in the same room, within minutes of each other, is one of the strangest audience responses a blockbuster has ever produced. For Rey, who had come to see Han as the father figure she never had after connecting with him on that Falcon, the loss cut at the exact point where she'd just begun to feel safe. For Leia, watching the man she'd loved across decades and across wars die at the hand of their own son, the devastation registered as something fans described as almost too painful to witness. And for Chewbacca, whose grief was rendered without a single line of dialogue, just a roar and a collapse, the emotional devastation was absolute. The script had 40 years of creative tension baked into it, and that is precisely why it landed so hard. Ford's desire to kill the character off in Return of the Jedi was no secret, and his contractual absence from episodes 8 and 9 meant the franchise was always going to have to address Solo's eventual fate. The only remaining question was when and how. The staging, the railless walkway, the stab, the fall into a pit that becomes a sun was already locked in before anyone stepped onto that set. What the script could not control, and what made the death unbearable for so many, was the decades of emotional investment that had accumulated around a character audiences had watched survive impossible situations since 1977. He'd always been the one who improvised his way out. This time, the script gave him nothing to grab onto. Kanan Jarrus. Han Solo's death had the mitigating context of decades of narrative setup and the actor's own expressed desire. It made a kind of broken internal logic. Kanan Jarrus' death has no such excuse. It happens faster than the audience can process it, and the script is careful to show that he had options. He just didn't take them. Kanan Jarrus was a Jedi Knight who had completed his training before the Empire rose, a man who had already lost one apprentice to this war and was determined not to fail Ezra Bridger the same way. He spent years hiding his identity and his order aboard the Ghost alongside Hera Syndulla, Ezra Bridger, and Sabine Wren, running supply missions and intelligence operations, while carefully avoiding any confrontation that would expose his connection to a religion the Empire had spent decades erasing. Grand Admiral Thrawn captured Hera Syndulla during a mission, and Kanan assembled the crew to rescue her. Hera, in the chaos before the Empire's countermeasures sealed their escape route, told him she loved him. The Empire responded by detonating a fuel tower and collapsing the structure around them. The explosion hit, and Kanan used the Force to push the flames away from his friends, fully understanding that he would have no escape. A specialist might note that Jedi are shown phasing through solid matter under sufficient concentration, that Kanan had demonstrated that specific ability in a prior episode, that there was a doctrinal argument to be made for preservation of life as the highest Jedi imperative. But the scene doesn't treat that as an oversight. It treats it as a choice, and the choice is the point. When Hera finally saw what Kanan had done, she was standing in the corridor, watching the fire consume him, the words she'd spoken to him moments before now echoing inside a silence he'd bought with his own life. Obi-Wan Kenobi. If Kanan's death affected a crew of 5 people on a single ship, Obi-Wan Kenobi's death echoes outward until it has touched every surviving character and every event in the entire saga. He was a Jedi Master who served as a general in the Republic Army during the Clone Wars, and he was the man who watched Satine, the only person he'd ever truly loved outside the Order, die in his arms at the hands of Darth Maul. When he faced his former apprentice on the Death Star, he was already carrying the weight of every loss that had defined his adult life. He allowed the strike to land. His body vanished into the Force the moment Vader struck, robes falling empty to the deck as Luke watched. And in that same instant, Obi-Wan's voice reached across the void to guide Luke toward the only action that could turn his death into something other than waste: the destruction of the Death Star. The man who died on that walkway didn't just die. He became, in the most literal sense, more powerful than anyone in the room could have imagined. His death the instrument that completed the mission his life had been moving toward since the day he took Anakin as a Padawan. The contradiction, the hollowed man whose surrender became the rebellion's first real victory, resolves in that final walk onto the walkway with nothing in his hands but a lightsaber he never ignited, and a knowledge that what he was doing was the only thing he had left that mattered. Kylo Ren. The previous entry ended with a life extinguished by a planet-destroying weapon, impersonal, distant, mechanical. This one isn't. This is a son pulling the trigger on his own father. Ben Solo had been drifting toward the dark side for years before he stood on the gantry of Starkiller Base and drove a lightsaber through Han Solo's chest. Mentored by Luke Skywalker, he had felt abandoned and betrayed, leaving him exposed to Snoke's manipulation. The guilt from that murder haunted him constantly, alongside the pull of the good still buried inside him and his impossible connection to Rey. Han Solo's death in The Force Awakens, killed by his own son, ranks among the best and most heartbreaking death scenes across the entire saga. By the rise of Skywalker, Kylo Ren had become supreme leader of the First Order, but he was still Ben Solo running from himself. And then came Exegol. Leia, Organa, died after reaching out to her son through the Force during their duel, her final act not an attack, but a desperate attempt to pull him back. It worked. Through his complicated quasi-romantic bond with Rey, Ben Solo returned to the light. Here's where the numbers hit hardest. 2 deaths bookend Ben Solo's arc. Han Solo, murdered by his son on Starkiller Base. Leia Organa, dying to bring her son back. Both parents dead because of Kylo Ren, both deaths defining the single most destructive bloodline in the Skywalker saga. Ben Solo gave up his own life to save someone he loves, finally turning back to the light. 2 parents dead. 1 son gone. The Skywalker line ends not in glory but in grief. The larger cost is structural. The Skywalker family doesn't just lose individual members, it consumes itself. Han dies by his son's hand. Leia dies reaching for her son. Ben dies saving the woman who loved him. 3 deaths, all family, all self-inflicted in one form or another. The curse of the Skywalkers isn't the dark side, it's that every generation seems required to destroy the one that made it. Anakin Skywalker. If Kylo Ren's sin was intimate, a blade between parent and child, Anakin's was institutional. One man's fall from grace was the instrument that erased almost the entire Jedi Order, the spiritual backbone of the galaxy for over 1,000 generations. But that purge was orchestrated by Darth Sidious, with Anakin serving as the blade that executed the Emperor's grand design. Discovered as a slave on Tatooine by Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi, trained as a Jedi Knight, hero of the Clone Wars, and then in a single catastrophic arc, Darth Vader helped hunt the Jedi to near extinction. The timeline is brutal. Order 66 didn't just kill Jedi, it killed the institution that had trained them, the temples that housed them, the traditions that defined galactic civilization for millennia. One former Jedi Knight turned Sith became the architect of that collapse. The scenes between Anakin Skywalker and Luke Skywalker in Return of the Jedi are described as the best in the film. Darth Vader's death scene ranks among the best in the entire Skywalker saga. Both facts exist because the story gave Anakin something worth redeeming. A son who saw past the armor, past the crimes, past the monster, and found a father who was still there. Anakin appears in Return of the Jedi, the same film as Yoda's entry, but where Yoda's death closes a natural life, Anakin's closes a wound. The Chosen One died as a father, not a Sith Lord, not Vader, but Anakin Skywalker. That's the sentence people repeat to their friends. The greatest Jedi who ever lived died because his son loved him enough to see the man beneath the mask. Yoda. The previous entry ended with the violent collapse of a chosen hero consumed by darkness. This one ends with a very old frog dying quietly in a swamp, which is exactly what makes it strange. Yoda died peacefully of old age in 4 ABY on the swamp planet Dagobah at roughly 900 years old, and his body vanished as he became one with the Force, a phenomenon achieved only by the most powerful and enlightened Jedi Masters. Luke Skywalker was at his side. In those final moments, Yoda revealed that there was another Skywalker, referring to Luke's twin sister Leia, and imparted his last wisdom about facing Darth Vader and completing his training. His death was sad, but not tragic. He became a Force spirit who continued to help his still living allies after his passing. The strangeness is in the timeline. Yoda trained Jedi for over 800 years and played integral roles in the Clone Wars, the instruction of Luke Skywalker, and unlocking the path to immortality. He retreated into exile on Dagobah in 19 BBY after Order 66 and his failed duel with Emperor Palpatine in Revenge of the Sith. Luke Skywalker arrived on Dagobah seeking training from Yoda in 3 ABY, as depicted in The Empire Strikes Back. 16 years in a swamp, hiding, waiting for the one boy who might undo what the galaxy had done. Yoda's ability to retain consciousness after death showed mastery of the living Force techniques learned from Qui-Gon Jinn, expanded on in the Clone Wars, which means his exile wasn't waste. It was preparation for a role he'd play after death. The cost isn't dramatic, it's quiet. The most powerful Jedi who ever lived ended as a ghost whispering advice, not as the Grand Master who'd trained Jedi for 8 centuries. That's the human strangeness of it. 900 years of leadership, and the final chapter is hiding in a bog until a farm boy shows up to learn how to lift a spaceship. Mace Windu. Where Yoda's death was an ending, Mace Windu's was a collapse, the moment the entire Jedi Order ceased to exist. He was the champion, the grim, amethyst-bladed master who had served the Republic since before the Clone Wars and who Palpatine himself genuinely feared. As the war intensified, Mace sensed the dark side at work and knew the Order's enemies were plotting to destroy every last one of them. And his appearances across episodes 1 and 2, The Clone Wars, and Tales of Jedi reveal a man whose tolerance for Senate failure and rebellious Jedi opinion had been ground down to nothing. When he finally cornered Palpatine in his office, Mace came within seconds of killing the man who had orchestrated everything. Anakin's intervention was the only thing that stopped him. Palpatine responded with Force lightning that threw Mace Windu through the window of the Senate building, dropping him onto the streets of Coruscant below. Nobody recovered his body, no memorial was held, no Jedi funeral pyre was lit. His amethyst blade, the most distinctive in the entire Order, simply vanished from the story the moment he fell. And before you point to the theories, yes, people have argued for years that he survived, that he caught himself, that he's out there somewhere. Canon says otherwise. Revenge of the Sith establishes his fall. The Clone Wars series establishes the scope of his service and his death. Tales of Jedi confirms where he stood in the Order's final hours. There is no return, no hidden survival, no last-minute rescue. He fell from that window, and the galaxy's most powerful defender was simply gone. The dark side's first great victory completed not with drama, but with a body hitting the pavement while the Republic's armies stood watching. What makes the Deathland harder is what died with him. Mace Windu wasn't just a skilled warrior, he was the one who saw the trap clearly and acted on it, the one who came closest to stopping Palpatine before Anakin's fear intervened. His death removed the Order's only serious counterweight to the Sith at the exact moment counterweight mattered most. The galaxy lost its best defender in a single instant, and the next 12 years of Imperial rule were the direct consequence. Count Dooku. Where Mace Windu's death destroyed an entire order, Dooku's was dismantled with even less ceremony, a man whose killing was designed not for narrative weight but for plot efficiency. Count Dooku, the secret Sith Lord Darth Tyrannus, had been trained by Grandmaster Yoda himself before leaving the Jedi Order to lead the Confederacy of Independent Systems against the Republic. He arrived on Geonosis as a genuine threat, dueling Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker simultaneously, striking Anakin with Force Lightning, wounding Obi-Wan, and severing Anakin's right arm before Yoda absorbed Dooku's own lightning and forced him to flee, and that was the most respect anyone ever showed him in the entire war. In Revenge of the Sith, Dooku's death occurs in the opening sequence. He is killed by decapitation, Anakin cutting his head off at Palpatine's direct order. The script positioned his death early so General Grievous could take over as the main Separatist villain for the rest of the film, which means Dooku is killed not because the story needed his arc to end, but because the story needed to clear space for a different villain. Business Insider ranks his death at number 31 out of 38 notable Star Wars movie deaths, calling him a pointless villain, and the rank is accurate. The film treated him as disposable, and he was. The turn is sharper than that. Dooku had spent years conspiring with Sidious in a secret plot, convinced he was building something real with his master. He forgot, or never fully understood, that betrayal is the nature of the Sith. The moment Anakin needed to be bound more tightly to the dark side, Sidious sacrificed Dooku without a second thought. He died not as a defeated rival, but as a discarded tool, realizing too late that he had never been a partner. He was always the instrument that gets broken once the real work begins. Jyn Erso. Where Dooku died in a controlled, pre-planned political execution, Jyn Erso's death was the indiscriminate erasure of a planet, and she was standing right at the center of it. Jyn Erso was a member of the Rogue One team that infiltrated Scarif's heavily fortified Imperial archives and stole the complete plans for the Death Star, transmitting them to the Rebel fleet before anything else could be destroyed. When the Death Star fired on Scarif's surface, Jyn died on the beach she had just fought across, Captain Cassian Andor beside her, the planet vaporized beneath them by the very weapon they had just defeated. Most Star Wars deaths in this canon happen in combat or by execution, personal, visible, contained within the scope of a duel or a battlefield. Jyn's death was different in kind. She didn't die fighting a person. She died because the Empire had built a weapon designed to erase history and geography simultaneously, and she was standing on the geography when it fired. The Death Star destroyed Scarif's entire surface, melting the tropical world into molten rock, and everyone on it, Jyn, Cassian, the entire ground team, died together in a blast so total that recovering bodies wasn't even a consideration. That's not a narrative choice the Empire made, it's a weapon capability, and it killed her with the same indifference it would show every world caught in its path. People confuse this death with the self-sacrifice trope, and the surface similarity is understandable. She ran toward the transmitter, she knew the blast was coming, she chose to stay and transmit. But the distinction cuts through the sentiment. A sacrifice is a deliberate choice to die for a cause. Jyn was fighting to get off that beach. She got caught in the blast. She died not because the story needed a martyr, but because the Empire had built a planet killer, and she happened to be standing on a planet when it fired. The Death Star killed her the way it killed everyone else, with overwhelming impersonal force, no ceremony, no recognition, just the mathematical certainty of a super laser delivering its full yield to a coordinate on a map. Jyn Erso transmitted the Death Star's architectural weakness to the Alliance fleet and died watching the station she had just defeated destroy the world beneath her feet. She never knew the plans she risked everything to steal actually worked. She died thinking she might have failed, and the galaxy moved on without her until Luke Skywalker fired that shot months later and made her sacrifice mean something the Empire could never erase. Cassian Andor. Where Jyn Erso died choosing to stand her ground on a beach at Scarif, Cassian Andor died running towards something. He'd been fighting the Empire since he was a child. And the Rogue One mission to Scarif, the mission to steal the Death Star plans, was the operation that killed him. Those two facts are the whole shape of his arc. A child who became a rebel who died a rebel's death, and a mission that required exactly that kind of life to even attempt. Tony Gilroy stated that the Andor series' 24 episodes across 2 seasons would give each of Cassian's scenes in Rogue One deeper significance, making his death even sadder. That's a deliberate design choice. The show isn't filling in gaps, it's retrofitting weight onto a moment the original film didn't have the runtime to justify. Cassian's first scene in Rogue One is him killing a contact on Kenari, or rather, he doesn't kill him, he lets the Empire do it and walks away. That one scene becomes a different thing entirely once you've watched a season and a half of how he got there. His last words, "Rebellions are built on hope," read differently when you know he's been sustaining that hope since before he could read. The question nobody has answered is whether Cassian understood what he was walking into on Scarif. The mission was always a one-way trip by design. He knew the risks. Whether he knew his life was building toward exactly that moment, that the child who started fighting the Empire would die on a beach trying to steal its greatest weapon, is something the films never said, and the series hasn't settled yet. Luke Skywalker, where Cassian Andor died caught in machinery he couldn't control, Luke Skywalker died by design. Haunted by Ben Solo's fall to evil and convinced the Jedi had to end, he sought exile on a distant world, ignoring the galaxy's pleas for help. But when the Resistance needed him most, he didn't respond with a fleet or a lightsaber. He projected an illusion of himself halfway across the galaxy to distract the First Order and give the Resistance the opening they needed to escape. He passed on in The Last Jedi's closing minutes, and the scene is described as one of the most purely beautiful scenes in the film, his life coming to a fitting end. Some viewers push back hard on this. The argument has teeth. His body never left the island. No First Order soldier on Kraid ever struck him down. He never drew his weapon, never exchanged a single blow, never touched the ground. How is this a death? What did he actually sacrifice? That objection is fair, but the scene isn't built for that kind of accounting. Luke's journey ends the same way it began, with him looking out into the horizon at a binary sunset as John Williams' The Force theme swells like it did in the first Star Wars 40 years prior. The Force projection drained him completely, and that's where he died. Alone, on an island, having reached across the galaxy one last time in a way no Jedi before him ever had. The contradiction the scene opened with, a Jedi abandoning the galaxy, then returning as something the galaxy has never seen, resolves not in spectacle, but in that quiet, deliberate symmetry. The Force theme swells, and he's gone. Leia Organa, where Luke Skywalker arranged his own ending with full narrative control, Leia Organa got too. Princess Leia Organa was the daughter of Padme Amidala and Anakin Skywalker, sister of Luke Skywalker. She was adopted by Senator Bail Organa and raised as his daughter on Alderaan. She founded the Resistance after being sidelined by the New Republic's political leaders. She died in The Rise of Skywalker, giving her life to bring Ben Solo back from the dark side. Leia was killed in a comic story by Alan Moore published in Marvel UK's The Empire Strikes Back Monthly in 1982. That comic death predates every canonical ending the character ever received. Predates Carrie Fisher's performance, predates the sequel trilogy, predates the entire franchise's second act. It's not an alternate version of her, and not a throwaway gag. It's a death that happened, printed in black and white on newsprint, released to readers, filed away in the continuity, and then overwritten by later stories. Most characters get one canonical death, Leia Organa got two, and neither of them was the one she was supposed to have. That's not a quirk of publishing. That's a statement about what canon actually does. It doesn't protect characters from contradiction, it accumulates it. Every ending she received in the film sits beside that 1982 death in the same continuity, and both are real to someone who lived through them. The Resistance was her idea, the New Republic sidelined her, and she built something new to fill the gap, and she died twice for it. The second death was filmed and screened for millions and treated as the real one. The first death was printed on newsprint and quietly set aside. Only one of those deaths was mourned publicly. Both of them happened. Shmi Skywalker, Leia died reaching her son through the Force. Shmi Skywalker Lars never got that. She died before her son could reach her at all. The mother of Anakin Skywalker, she spent years as a slave on Tatooine raising him in Mos Espa, and when Qui-Gon Jinn discovered the boy's strength with the Force, winning Anakin, his freedom meant winning it for himself alone. Shmi remained behind. A decade passed, Anakin returned as a Jedi, found her dying in a Tusken Raiders camp, and held her as she died before he could save her. That loss, his first, his worst, the one that cracked the foundation of everything else, happened off-screen before the Star Wars story proper even began. Anakin's fall to the dark side is often traced to that moment, and that is the small version of the problem. His turn is explained through Palpatine's manipulation, through the Clone Wars, through the weight of war, but the wound that made all of it possible is a death the films never show, and the canon never fully grieves. Ask what it would take for the ordinary version to be true. For the story to honor what Shmi's death cost Anakin, the canon would have to return to that tent, to the body, to the scream. That condition is not met. The canon moves forward, Anakin's grief becomes Darth Vader's rage, becomes the Emperor's tool. And the woman who started it all remains a name in a biography, not a scene in a film. There is no canonical return for her, no afterlife status, no moment the saga circles back to hold. The mother of Anakin, Skywalker, died enslaved on Tatooine, and the galaxy moved on without her. Admiral Ackbar. Where Shmi Skywalker's death is ancient and off-screen, Ackbar's is current and in your face, except it isn't, because it takes 15 seconds. The Mon Calamari Fleet Admiral of the Resistance dies off-screen in Star Wars The Last Jedi when the bridge of the Resistance flagship is destroyed. Admiral Ackbar was killed alongside other Resistance leaders when that bridge was destroyed, the loss witnessed by Leia Organa while she survived through Force powers that drew every eye away from the people who didn't. Many fans were upset about Admiral Ackbar's death, calling it unceremonious and feeling slighted by how quickly and with how little screen time it happened. His on-screen death in the film was brief and undramatized, and his death was not shown directly, causing some viewers to miss it entirely. Here's where it gets worse. Tom Kane, who voiced Ackbar in The Last Jedi, felt Ackbar's death was a missed opportunity and that he deserved the heroic death given to Vice Admiral Holdo instead. The lack of a heroic send-off for Admiral Ackbar led to ongoing fan discussions and even avenging campaigns on social media, reflecting the emotional impact of a death the canon refused to dramatize. Admiral Ackbar's death marked the end of his long service as Fleet Admiral for the Resistance, and his legacy was honored mostly by fans and not by major characters in the film. There is no canonical return or afterlife status for Admiral Ackbar. His death remains final in the Disney Star Wars canon. Defenders of the choice would point to narrative economy and limited runtime, and that explanation cannot hold against the 15 seconds given to a character who appeared in Return of the Jedi, The Force Awakens, and now this. The canon had time. It chose not to use it. Ackbar's death was not an accident of timing. It was a decision about whose story deserved weight, and his did not make the cut. Vice Admiral Holdo, Ackbar died in 15 seconds and received nothing. Holdo appears in Star Wars The Last Jedi. As Vice Admiral of the Resistance, and in one act of self-sacrifice redefined what space combat even means in this universe. The tactic she executed, later called the Holdo Maneuver, was unprecedented in Star Wars space combat and had never been seen before. Laura Dern's character leaps into the light-speed gap between what the canon had established as possible and what the story demanded in the moment, and the result is a maneuver so consequential it will be referenced for as long as this canon continues. That is the underlying mechanism running through all three of these endings. The canon decides what deserves memory, what earns ceremony, and what gets swept aside in 15 seconds, and that decision has nothing to do with service length or fan attachment, and everything to do with whose sacrifice serves the story being told in the moment. Holdo's maneuver matters because the canon said it mattered. Ackbar's death didn't, so the canon let it happen off-screen. There is no deeper justice at work, only the cold mechanics of narrative priority, and Admiral Ackbar of the Resistance, who had served since Return of the Jedi, voice of the Rebel Alliance for 3 films, simply didn't make the list.